Hi.
Welcome to Bad at Sports.
And welcome to Chicago.
Thank you.
Or welcome back, really. Weren't you born here?
Thank you. Yes, I was.
So I thought we should get started first by talking about the Bergen Kunsthal and the space you came from before you got here to join us as the new director of the Renaissance Society.
Yes. So Bergen Kunsthal is in Bergen, obviously, in Norway. It is an institution for contemporary art as well. It's a Kunstverein, so it's built around this sort of German institutional model. There is no collection, and it's members. And it was founded in 1838. And the institution changed name in 2001 to Bergen Kunsthalle. So also a German model for an institution. It did so in order to open up a little bit more for audiences in Bergen, but also to connect a little bit more to the international art scene. So that was when I started. I started in Bergen Kunsthal in 2000, and I became director in 2003. So I was sort of part of the whole change of name and change of profile in a way.
Well, so you go from that and being the part of a restructuring of a very venerable institution to another very venerable institution here in Chicago and succeeding in the enormously talented and successful Suzanne Ghez, which is, it's got to be one of the more intimidating jobs to walk into. So,
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, once you found the opportunity and you found that you were going to do it? I mean, looking at the history of the Renaissance Society, it must have been like, holy crap, now what?
Yeah. Well, I was in Bergen. I had just accepted a new term in Bergen when they called me if I wanted to be part of the interviewing for the new director. I have always followed the program at the Renaissance Society, and I always admired it. It's a diamond of an institution. This institution has such a strong voice on the international art scene. Everybody talks about it. In Europe, especially, we've been following. Probably, it's one of the most famous institutions in Europe, in a way, in a certain kind of group, at least. So we've been following this, me and my colleagues, and of course, when I got this phone call, it was very, frightening, but also very exciting. I'd been in Bergen then for 13 years, developing it into this more international-based Kunsthalle and working with a lot of artists that actually had a kind of a similarity with the Renaissance Society. And the Ren had this kind of independence that I seek also as a curator and director. And that was what actually made me dare to do it. Because at this institution, it's a small institution, it's a flexible institution, but it's very focused. And Suzanne Ghez has made this wonderful foundation that I will protect and build further, hopefully. So that was also, to take part of that seemed like a fantastic opportunity. That despite fear, I had to do it.
Well, it's a very unique space. I mean, it's completely unassuming. It's not obvious. I mean, in terms of, you get there, it's on the second floor of a building or whatever floor it's on, not the first floor. It's not obvious from the street. I mean, and you get there and it's this open room that's had, I mean, an amazing number of shows that turned out to be pivotal in people's careers or of particular historic importance.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's really, there's something alchemical about it, and what has gone on there from what it is, where it is, and its beginnings. It's a very not a lot of other places I can think of that have that sort of weight for being, essentially a small university gallery originally. I mean, from what it then developed into afterwards.
The fact that it's at the university, but not of the or part of the university, is also a special role, and it gives it a certain kind of academic, intellectual frame around the exhibitions that I think is extremely interesting. But I've been talking to many of my colleagues because in our mind, not so many have visited the Ren, especially not from Europe. I mean, we're of course more and more have seen the space, but now and then you speak with people and they are all a little bit surprised of this venue, because in our head, in our mind, this institution is huge, it's grand, it's like you see it with columns and stairs and, huge space. And when you come there, it's like this elevator and you go up there and then this little classroom. classrooms on each side, and then there's a beautiful space. And it's not so very big. And in the beginning, I was also a little bit like, oh, really? So, okay. So this is the Renaissance Society. This is the space. But I've been there now 2.5 months, and I love it. And the space is of a size where you can actually focus. You can do really interesting projects there. And I think that's also why they kept this place, this venue for the Renaissance Society, that you actually can go in depth, work with artists, do groundbreaking exhibitions that are really significant for artists. So I think that the fact that it's not huge is also a positive role, and the fact that it's at the university in this intellectual hub also fits with the way the Renaissance Society should work and will definitely work further, to work with research, to work in depth with artists, to be in a dialogue with artists at all time, use time, figure out like a testing platform for different projects for artists.
I'm sure there's some clever architecture student or art history student somewhere who's done advanced research into literally the size of shows, the square footage, and what tends to yield what, right? Like a retrospective or a major, museum blockbuster show tends to be X amount of square feet, right? And sort of a more, you look at museums that have smaller sort of cutting edge shows tend to be, on the small side. And there's something about the scale of the Renaissance Society that is like just in the middle.
Yes.
Where it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of push to do these sort of like sprawling survey, things. And even when they've done shows that are more retrospective, they tend to just hit the keynotes. And I mean, it's like it gives you an excuse to not have to do some of the more grueling, massive stuff, but you have enough room to sort of transcend the sort of little tiny show. So I mean, I wonder how much the space has dictated over the years, the direction.
Some, I think, it might have, but also it's a little bit about finding its institutional role in the landscape here, also in Chicago, but also in the States. And I think for me, at least, what I want to focus on further is the production of new works. I think that the Renaissance Society can be an engine for new production, meaning that when artists come and we invite artists, we will not do the retrospectives. There are so many museums that does that. We're not a museum. We're not collecting. We're not actually looking back. We're looking at the moment as it is and also looking forward. So for me, it will be crucial and very important to have a dialogue with the artists that I invite and try to figure out where is this artist at this point right now, what would this artist like to do at this moment, and test that out. Of course, then you have to take some risks. But I believe that also by given the chance to fail or given the possibility to fail, often gives way for great works of art. And that is a position that the REN actually can take because of its size, because of its, situation and its the whole structure around it. So that will be a very important part of the going forward, I think. And this is where I think we can actually have a role in the institutional landscape, that we go in and we are commissioning new works. We produce new, and we also challenge the artists in that way. Because, of course, and we challenge ourselves as curators, because as a curator, you invite an artist often based on the works you know before. You have seen something, you like it, you know that other people might like it, it's safe, you can put it up in an exhibition. So in the way of saying, yes, we like what you've done, but now we want to see where you are at the moment, right now. What would you like to do in a dialogue with us? Where is there something that you have been going around thinking about that you would like to do that you haven't been able to do yet because you've been at bigger retrospective shows, or that you've been, not given the possibility financially? So this is the moment, this is the place where these works can come about. And that is also a challenge because, of course, as curator, you would then not know. All of a sudden, the artist makes something totally different from what you thought you would get and present to the audience and your board. So,
do you look at I think that there has always been that's a space that tends to encourage the experimental, certainly. But I do think that they've had a large part of their history, and off the top of my head, the last 5-10 years, has also had sort of group shows or sort of the more standard gallery exhibition as well. Are you looking at taking it in a more project space direction, where people can come in and perhaps do something on a scale or in a way that they might not necessarily do otherwise?
Not necessarily project-based. I think it's more giving the artist the possibility to work with new works. It's the same type of, you invite an artist, you give them a slot, like a period that the show is going to be up, but then you start the dialogue. So it's not of a project more, it's the final show will be as, solid and as any other show, but it's just, I think that we will be the one that produces these new works. So that's the main focus in that sense.
Kind of a visionary support, really.
Hopefully, yes.
So how do you see... So when I think about the Wren, I think about Suzanne's 40 years at the helm of the Wren, and that sort of the burden that places on you.
This is starting to be...
which is, sounds kind of scary, because Suzanne really did define that space. Yes. So that you talking about in Europe, knowing the space and knowing the program and knowing the impact that the Wren has had internationally. I just wonder, when you step into those shoes, do you worry about, how much do I have to bear this legacy, and how much do I want to just separate myself from it, burn it to the ground, and then start a whole new thing?
I do not want to burn anything to the ground. That's the first thing.
That would have been my first temptation.
No, I don't want to do that. I want to build on it. And I totally respect, and I totally want to also make it visible what has been done there. By Suzanne and by other curators, by Hamza Walker. There's been an enormous amount of shows coming up from that institution that is very important and crucial. But the reason why I'm not that afraid is actually because I trust the artists. The institution is one thing, and the director is another thing, and the artist is the most important thing. So therefore, my job will be to... yes, care for the legacy, but definitely to be the one that makes the intellectual framework, the physical and intellectual framework, as good as possible for artists to work within. And this is where I have confidence, because this is what I did in Bergen, and I'm not so afraid of that. I'm afraid if everybody's going to, compare me to Suzanne Guest, then I get afraid. But that's just part of the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't know if you can avoid
but I'm not
that,
afraid as long as I can just focus on the work, the artist, the shows that I'm going to do. So it's going to be fine.
Yeah, I would imagine that 50% of the questions you've been asked in the first X number of months of the job have been about Suzanne Guest, which has got to wear a little thin after a while. Just like we're doing now.
But I think that there's also a lot to be flattered by in that,
yeah,
right?
Definitely.
They're big shoes to fill, but the fact that you're compared to those shoes is pretty sweet.
But it's golden slippers to walk into also. They're big shoes, but they're golden, and it's nice, but they also... I wouldn't have done my job, and I wouldn't have respected Suzanne either and her job if I didn't look at what she's done and try to, optimize it. I guess that's the word I would use. Build it further.
I just had a vision of Suzanne, doing a sorority sort of hazing when she came in. It's before you take the job, you got to drink 12 shots of vodka.
Like a party night out with Suzanne, where
pretty
she
much
just
like a test, right? Just make sure that she's got the sufficient metal to.
It's like you've never been to the University of Chicago.
I think that my vision of it's funnier than how it actually is.
That's because no one there thinks it's funny at all.
That's
or would recognize
incredibly
anything
true.
Funny. I wanted to get back to that question about Bergen, and that was a Kunsthal that you really built up, helped grow substantially, versus the Wren, which you step into this huge legacy. You already have the budget and support in place. And I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about comparing those two tasks and the 10 years you spent building up Bergen and this future task?
Well, so Bergen is Bergen. It's Norway. Bergen is a little city in Norway. It's really on the outskirt of the art world as such. But it's a huge, that is a bigger space. It's a wonderful architecture, and we were able to do, huge exhibitions there, big shows by artists that we thought were interesting, and we managed in the end to work with artists that we thought were relevant at that point, and to, make a difference in their careers, produce new works for them. And I have to say because this is really a team thing. This is nothing that I did alone. Because Bergen, when I started at Bergen, when I took over there, actually nobody applied for that job, so I got it just because the institution was bankrupt, honestly. I can say this now, but yes, it was. So the board, I was there, I was the curator. They asked me if I could step up and do this, constitute a director. So I did that. There were 2 or 3, 100% positions in addition to myself. And so I did it for 1 year, and I liked it. So then when the position was I don't know, put out there, I don't know how you say that, I applied. So I got the job. But the first time around, honestly, there were nobody else. So that's actually a very easy way in. I have to be honest. But then the years went, and we needed, of course, the economy, the financials was very low. We needed to get the money. And in Norway, the private funding is not like it is. The philanthropy, people pay their taxes. They're done. So it's not very easy to get sponsoring, private funders. But we worked on that. So we gathered a little group that supported our program. And in the end, we understood that we needed to get to the state. It was the cultural minister we needed to attack, because in Norway, the real funding is in the state. So fundraising in Norway, compared to here, where I just experienced my first benefit auction, which is very glamorous, I have to say. In Norway, that is not such a glamorous fundraising. So we have coffee, cold coffee, in some bureaucrat's office, 12 o'clock on a Tuesday, and that's it. And you talk half an hour, and then you're out of there. And you hopefully get some money. And little by little, we managed to convince the bureaucrats, the politicians, that Bergen Kunstfestival was worthwhile. And in the end, after those 13 years, we're a very well-funded exhibition space and an institution. The new director there, who is Martin Clark from Tate St. Ives, he will get this wonderful office that we just rebuilt.
But it's karma, Suzanne has, set you up and has already relationships built. So, hopefully, whatever he left is also taken care of.
Of course, yes.
Down the way.
Hopefully.
So did Suzanne, when you were coming in, did she warn you and say, like, okay, look, there's going to be a lot of whining and dining octogenarians, so just get ready for it? I mean, I think I'm kidding, but I mean, I know that I've talked to. We've done a number of interviews with museum directors and curators throughout the history of the show, and it's I won't name names, but it's been interesting, sort of a side conversation about the process of, and how, especially at museums, more so than independent style institutions that don't have collections necessarily, but how much a part of their day-to-day life is that sort of maintaining, the fundraising program. So.
Since we don't have a collection, we don't have that addition.
Right.
So, of course, what we need to do is to get funding for the program.
Well, but you fund new work, which isn't exactly cheap either. So, yeah.
So that's the new thing. That's the project coming up, figuring out who's going to support that New Works initiative. And I think it's going to be fine. But the difference there is, of course, very big for a Scandinavian, Norwegian coming to the States for that different kind of fundraising. But I think that as long as I don't have to compromise with the program, and I don't have to, be something that I'm not as a curator, or makes the artist do something they're not, willing to do, or if the artistic program does not have to compromise, I don't have a problem of, talking to people and trying to convince people to support this.
I did think that the Thomas Kincaid show coming up was a bit of a softball for fundraising.
What's that?
Just kidding.
Joking. I just came to this country. I don't know anything about.
Thomas Kincaid was sort of an incredibly successful financially painter who painted little cottages.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Life.
That's another way to do it.
He's dead now, so it doesn't really matter. But anyway. So, yesterday we had a panel discussion with Patty Johnson from Artifact City in New York and Forrest Nash and Josh Baer. And one of the things that came up in the conversation, which was something we talked about afterwards at our post-panel drinking binge over in the lounge with their $18 beers, was the role of the institution in Europe, and again, that's incredibly broad brush, versus here as tastemaker versus galleries, and where galleries tend to be, or at least this was what was thrown out there and disputed in some regards, but the galleries tend to be the people who sort of set the agenda for who is up and coming and who are and who is going to be successful and paid attention to, and what was suggested was that as opposed to Europe, where the institution has more influence than the galleries. I mean, and I think the Renaissance Society is if that is indeed the case, which I don't know that it is, the Renaissance Society is one of those exceptions in terms of, because that has always been sort of a cutting edge program. But I mean, as a person who was in charge of an institution in Europe, I mean, do you find that in terms of being exploratory and looking at new works and new trends, I mean, do you think that is taken more seriously there than it is here?
In the institutional scene, or in the
institution,
in general?
like in terms of people who are looking for new work or new trends or things that are interesting, focus more on. Do you find that the institutions carry more weight in terms of that voice than they do in the United States?
But yes and no, both. But I think that those institutions, or anybody that claims that they're, being the first with trends, are not the one that does that. So it's a very dangerous path to go, and it's always something that I'm afraid when people somehow see that they're used some of the artists that I exhibited in Bergen, because they were, I exhibited Yang Wu in 2005, and I did it because it wasn't interesting. It was just coming out of the Art Academy, and when you have that kind of, that sometimes you find artists, you find them interesting, and then down the road they're everywhere. I always a little bit afraid, because that, if that's the positive thing, the only thing that's positive with that is the fact that these artists became huge. The positive thing was that he did a wonderful show in 2005, and he would have done that wonderful show in 2005 no matter what. So I think that that kind of, drive is a little bit dangerous. So in Bergen, what I saw, that there are some artists that, galleries took up and, developed further, and some they never were interested in. And that's the way it always is, and it should always be for an independent curator and for an independent institution. If we start to try to be, deliver. I was at a job, I'm not going to say where, but I was at a job interview once, and they asked me if how could they count on the fact that I would be a person that would, present artists that later would be big, and I said, you can't.
You didn't just bring out your crystal ball?
No,
check it out.
It's like, psychic wasn't in the job description.
It wasn't.
Sorry.
No. So I think that's and that's also sort of good for the artist, for the curators to know also, because it's not something we need to, we're responsible for the artist, for the art project that we're doing, and not for the market, for the trends. We're here to do as good a job we can with the exhibitions and the artists that we're producing.
So what can we look forward to in the near future from the Ren?
Nora Schultz. She's coming up January. That's my first show. And she will produce new works. She's a German artist living in Berlin. You can see a piece of her here in Isabella Bortolozzi. She's a wonderful artist. She's going to make a new book. So that's my first show. But of course, right now, we just opened a show of Hamza Walker that is open until December.
And what's that show?
That show is Suicide Narcissus. It's a group show.
It sounds uplifting.
Yes. it's actually a beautiful show. Very nice show.
So I think we have time for one audience question, and then we have to do this
Switch.
mad dash swap over. Who's got that one question? Don't feel pressured by the fact that it's only one question, and you will be asking it on behalf of the whole
Participation is 10% of your grade. There will be a quiz.
All right, I give up on you. Solveig, thank you so much.
So nice to meet you.
And we look forward to all the amazing stuff you're going to do over your 40 years there. So.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome home. Charlie James, William Powhida, welcome to Bad at Sports.
Thanks, fellas. Good to be here.
So, Charlie, I heard an anecdote on the wind, from the general scuttlebutt that goes around at art fairs, and I heard that you now divide pieces a la carte style. So if collectors show up and demand that they want a portion of something, you're just going to chop them up and
cut it with a saw.
And now I guess you're going to start selling portions of Williams pieces as bookmarks
I
for
had
$2.
Luckily, I averted a ethical challenge as a dealer. We had a blustery investment banker come in and. Anyway, parenthetically to begin, Williams made pieces that operate in conjunction. He's made his trademark certificate paintings, which are these trompe-l'oeil panels for which he's very well known. And he's also fabricated exemplars of styles that you're going to see a lot this weekend and on the International Art Fair circuit. Large-scale decorative abstractions, neo-modernist constructed junk stuff, bent forms on the ground.
Anyway, do you want your dealer describing your work as neo-modernist conceptual junk stuff? That's on your business cards now.
Maybe.
Right?
Well, I think the anecdote kind of highlights how the kind of divide that it kind of exists between collectors. I mean, this banker guy just was like, I want, these big, abstract panels. And, Dane is like, well, there's this other thing over here. And he's like, I don't want that. The
other thing being the signature Powhida piece, without which the piece is unsigned and effectively useless.
Well, and a portion of something.
But it got dangerously close to this guy offering us close to $20,000 for half of the piece, and I'm just glad I was away from the booth for a second. I didn't actually have to deal with this. But the guy ended up just tottering off into the ether, but it was a near miss.
Yeah.
I'm glad I didn't have to come face to face with this guy's black American Express card and zero knowledge of what he was actually buying.
You should have talked him into a commission of those and somehow worked a good joke into it somewhere. Secretly painted it with mayonnaise or something.
Secretly painted.
So that gives us a good entree into talking about Williams' current body of work and the work that's on view here in the last show at you guys' place, right? So William's been a past guest of the show, and we have some familiarity with him and his snotty punk nose anti-art kind of attitude.
Truth-telling, we call it.
Truth-telling.
Yeah. I don't know if it's truth-telling.
Institutional critique is the uptown name for the snotty...
jumped-up kid.
Right.
Hand
I suppose
biting.
it's easier to print than fuck you guys. So
that often appears in Williams' pieces actually, but
Right.
We made T-shirts that say "fuck those
we
guys."
did actually. My mom was proud.
She still wears hers to this day.
His mom joked.
So, but the show.
Show. Big hit. Great.
So in the show, just so everybody is on the same page, William, you made a bunch of kind of contemporary art doppelgangers, things that really look like the things we like to call contemporary art, or had them made in various ways.
Yeah.
And then made beautiful little watercolors to support it, filled with your sort of idiosyncratic marginalia, talking about that kind of experience and what should be made of this thing based on the kinds of classes of things that are contemporary art.
Yes. I mean,
it was inspired by Freeze, wasn't it, William? Was it Freeze?
Well, no, I mean,
2012,
it's been an ongoing thing, but, I was just talking to a young student who was, visiting the booth, and I remember going to my first, armory show and walking through and being like, so is this the stuff that, artists keep in their flat files? Where's the real art, And then that's, kind of dawned on me that this was the art market that I was walking into from graduate school, where it was like, you're not going to sell anything,
You're surrounded by messy weirdos.
Yeah,
everything's
like,
always...
fuck the man. Like,
Yeah.
we're not going to, we're going to go destroy capitalism. And then it just, the art
How's that
market was
working
on
out?
the ascent. Well, OWS gave it a shot. I mean, I spent, 6 months at arts and labor meetings and trying to decide what we were going to talk about for 6 months. But it's,
The state remains unsmashed.
yeah, the revolution is, on the horizon. It's always sort of perpetually, so we're in the market. But, making these objects, going to the Freeze tent when the first iteration of that came up and going through the giant armory show, it kind of, you stop seeing artwork and you just start to see these kind of things, and it starts to lose, meaning detaches and floats off somewhere into space. And you're like, there's another mound of clothes, something chromatically arranged, more, stuff. And it's, it starts to beg the question, how much of this stuff is just kind of design, and doesn't really have much symbolic value. You're not really going to talk too much about it. And that banker guy is like, he didn't give a fuck what this work was about. He just thought it would look good, over the couch.
And it would, let's be honest.
Yeah, well, and then the panel sort of detail how it was made. It was done, in 5 minutes in Photoshop on the couch. My wife walked by and said, "Those look pretty." And I said, "We're done. We're done here." Yeah. Send, print, and have them stretched, and they cost about, was it $1,000 to produce those things?
Yes.
Which is a lot of money for me. I mean, Charlie, without his, capitalist endeavor, backing some of the stuff, the show wouldn't happen. But some of them were also incredibly cheap. The neo-modern piece right now looks like some storm windows or something. That one was, $50 at Canal Street Plastic and some old stretchers, some white paint. But.
It's one of the things that comedy's really hard to pull off, and I think it's extra hard to pull off in art. And eventually, I will harass you at length because we're going to publish we're eventually going to publish a series of books from interviews and things that we've done, and I'm the editor on the comedy book, which sounded really fun and easy, and then the more I thought about it, and then is a lot harder than it sounds, and I think that you really have to ride and be constantly vigilant about the fact that you're poking fun at things that are so like art in and of itself, especially art fairs, which tend to be sort of the more garish, trade showy parts of art. It's almost impossible to discern parody from not parody. And I think that your work being fairly, concrete comedy-y, sort of dry, very subtle, I would imagine that a lot of people miss the point. Unless they know your work and what you're doing.
They gotta dive into the panels, or else it's just a common arrangement of familiar forms. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, the investment banker, cliche. I mean, that guy is it's literally the walking cliche that artists, in their "fuck the man" sort of dialogue talk about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Ben Davis just published his new book, 9.5 Theses on Art and Class, which came out of a process of, this other show that I collaborated with Jen Dalton on. And, one of his...
Did you do the cover for that book, William?
It was a 2009 painting, so it wasn't
But he borrowed a painting for the cover.
But it was still you, right? It was still you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure we got that in there.
Yes.
I like the fact that when he asked you sort of a matter of fact, you were like, well, but it was an old painting. So
yeah, I think Ben had said at some point, William did the cover for the book, and I'm like, I didn't just jump out, and crank this painting out for the cover of a book.
I'm not a fucking book cover designer.
Right.
Although I did hear you do the next Nora Roberts novel. So. No. There's a rumor I'm going to spread. That'll be fantastic.
Right, and now I have no idea what I was talking about. Ben, one of central points is that, art is definitely produced. It's the domain of the ruling class interests, and that banker guy kind of reflects a lot of how I kind of feel about, a certain level of collector's interest in art. There's not really a lot of care about what is going on or how it fits into a historical trajectory, what it means. It just, it's about its physical appearance, and that's about it. So that can be a little bit depressing. But the comedy thing, I just had a studio visit with a woman who is doing a 125-page dissertation on comedy and stand-up. And I think writing 125 pages about comedy is really difficult. And so she's looking at anyone in like any genre, any field of activity that has humor in their work.
You crack a joke in the street corner, she shows up and
Yeah. And I mean, it is really hard to introduce humor into art, and because it is so serious. And I mean, it's one of the challenges of even doing this work is that it pisses people off, and particularly artists, because, whether or not we like the work, an artist still, it's like a meaningful practice for them, even if they're producing something that just, I don't know, might be horrible, but they're very serious about it, and there's a kind of respect. And so one of the challenges with the show is not to try to like totally offend every artist I know who makes like a provisional painting or works with abstraction.
I feel like I would have started there. I would have started like I would have looked at all of my friends' practices and be like, okay, how do I make fun of each one of these practices? There's
some in the new panel painting here that like that panel was actually I'd done a sketch for it when I was at the Headlands, and I was on this residency with a lot of serious artists, and the more we started talking about this kind of idea, it ended badly. There's some people I'll never talk to again. But they thought they saw their work in it, and I'm like, oh no, I made this before I met you. I don't know, if you do this, that's interesting.
That's just a category of thing. But I think that's what's bothersome, and that's what I totally love about that body of work is that it weirdly identifies and kind of condenses into a clean pigeonhole a bunch of different types of work we don't usually find the right language to wrap around.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So
many people talk about the educational quality of particularly this body of work. William has a painting in the booth now called A Subjective Classification of Things, which is it's certainly not comprehensive, but it gets toward exhaustive list of the kind of formal tropes that you're going to see over and over again. And one of the things that happened, we were delighted. We got immediate coverage for the show in the LA Times, and all the talk of comedy and everything. This is of course critical to William. I mean, his wit and his insights cut so well. I mean, the guy can write, and combined with the insights and the draftsmanship, it's just a real powerful concentration of intellectual pleasure. That's what it's perfect for me. It rings the tuning fork in my mind. But what was said by Holly Myers in the LA Times, which was nice, was that William's not coming explicitly or fully from a derisive position, right? He loves art. It's all the guy thinks about, right? I don't talk about the Bears with William or the Yankees, We talk about art and pretty much, which is not, he's not a total monomaniac. He's but he's close.
He's also watching Star Trek.
He's dangerous.
So he's got like
not a total monomaniac.
Star Trek. He might be a monomaniac, but it comes from a place of love. And these kind of each one of the panels that talk about the tropes that he's fabricating, they don't just they do poke at it, but they're also kind of little disquisitions on how they work and where they come from. And behind this work, you might say, well, what does Powhida love? And Powhida is, of course, better to tell you about that than me.
It's him, right? I've always thought that it was just him.
Right. It's certainly. I certainly hope so. It all starts there. But I think the argument is a strident and very cogent argument for content. It's an argument for art that's critically engaging, that's activist in nature. And to be honest, as a dealer, I feel a petit, a little frisson, like I'm a little activist myself, maybe, right? Like our booth is a fair within a fair. It's activated by everything around it. I really feel like, if you want to see a great show at Expo Chicago, then come see what Powhida's put together, because it's activated by everything, and it's activating everything. To see his exemplars and then move about this beautiful fair, which we are proud to participate in, and we're doing well in, and we're happy. Parenthetically, right, like you can be against the current state of capitalism and still believe that objects have worth and that markets are efficient allocators of resources, right? We don't want to burn the world to the ground and start from year zero. But
speak for yourself.
Yeah,
the shining path of art.
But there, again, there's love, there's thought, and there's, the show. We've got a show in the booth, really. I view the booth as a show. And I think it's illuminating the experience for a lot of art fair goers as they move about. And the show, again, just to reiterate the point where I started with before this series of digressions, but people have talked about just how educational the work is. Because if you read his little opinings on neo-modernism and on post-minimalism, it's really quite illuminating.
But that becomes his role, right? Artist as art critic.
That's right. And historian in some ways. I think Powhida is a great historian.
That's why I find it sort of disappointing. I mean, I guess not surprising that anybody would be take offense, because I mean, I think that your work, I think that there's it's.
Are you kidding? He just has not got around to minimalist sort of sculpture, which will hit you.
Oh, we've got that. We've got that back in the day.
I spoke too soon. So he's got you in there.
Very good. But I mean, I think that it's all very. I mean, in order to make fun of it, you clearly have to be expert in your knowledge of it, right? I mean, I think that what you do belies a subtlety and an intellectualism and a knowledge that because it's not look, it's easy to poke fun at contemporary art. It's really lazy. It's a lazy joke, right? It's not hard to be like, that's stupid. My kid could do it, right? I don't think that's. I think that what you're doing is a very sort of loving,
I mean, absolutely. I don't want to come across as somebody who's an anti-intellectual. I mean, there's part of understanding art, there's so much of it is external. You have to have the knowledge to really understand it. Otherwise, it's just oh, it's a blue panel, and I have no context for how this came into being or why. But then I'm also trying to make the work accessible. I'm not trying to speak in international or English and talk about the spatiality of form and doing things simultaneously, negating and.
No, but it's still highly intellectual work.
Right.
I mean, I think you can appreciate it on a simple level, but I mean, really, it's very. You're clearly a very smart guy.
That's right.
Not to sound like president of your fan club, but I mean, you clearly have thought a lot about this, and it's not going for the lazy laugh or effect or whatever.
Well, your last speaker, it was kind of interesting talking about the differences between the European market and the American market, because clearly here the market is ascendant. We can look around the fair, and part of the reason why I'm making the work that I'm making is because you can just very quickly go see all the stuff that I'm kind of talking about, and there's so much of it. And whether it's trying to fill up all these art fair booths, and you've got fairs internationally, you've got galleries that are growing and expanding, and just Dan Colin had a show in New York that was universally panned, and then Gagosian just kind of sent him on tour of the world. It was there was always a Dan Colin show somewhere in the world, and eventually he'll come back to New York, with something gigantic. I'm sure the world's biggest piece of gum, and I can't make this work without kind of talking about this market, and a lot of my work is about how it feels to be kind of stuck in these conditions where, it might be nice to have the problem that the Europeans have, which is the curators have all the power and the bureaucrats have all the money, where here we're trying to squeeze it out of some wretched people, There's also some great people within it. And so it's this kind of paradoxical position. And, everyone always asks me, how can you justify participating in the market? And I'm like, well, what else is there? We've got... in Ben Davis's book, when he talks about nonprofits, the conclusion that this independent study found about nonprofits in America is that it would be best to help them die with dignity, to wind down, because there are proliferation of nonprofits and less money, and then it's dependent on the whims of some plutocrat, who's well, I've amassed billions and maybe I'll fund you, maybe I won't,
I used to joke that having managed and worked at a number of nonprofits, I used to joke that they were a lot like septic tanks, where the shit flows to the top.
Yeah, and it would be nice to have a little bit more of a balance, in this country between the market and public funding for the arts, so that it's not just all completely private. Because I just find it kind of awful that that guy is wandering around the fair
the guy who wanted to buy half your piece.
And when we're trying to define what is successful in the art world now, price is one of the easiest variables to identify. It's not complicated. You don't have to know shit about modernism or Greenberg. You don't have to know what was going on in 1968. It's just how much it costs. And so it's a very easy thing to kind of agree upon. The Oscar Murillo is, $400,000 at auction, therefore it's very good, and you don't have to kind of get into what does it mean that he's the next Basquiat? Like, why do we need another Basquiat? We need like version 7.0. I mean, my iPhone still works, but I'm going to have to buy a new one at some point. But it'll be like the 5th, 6th, 7th generation of the iPhone. And there's a certain point I'm like, well, I don't know what is valuable about that work anymore, and other than the price tag, and I just, and there's this kind of obsession with increasing the size of things, like, how many people showed up at the fair. I mean, Art Expo sent out their kind of like, temperature check email being like, well, we had 3,000 attendees, and here's
right.
a couple of people who showed up. So,
but I mean, everything's got to be gauged. Everything, everywhere, every business. I mean, that's the thing. Like, people like to ignore the fact that art is ultimately, in some ways, a business. I mean, making it isn't necessarily, but like, where people are like, I mean, you are a person whose career has been in sort of amplifying success, and hopefully will continue to do so. But that then you automatically have to deflect the criticism of like, well, how dare you be successful? Sell out. It's like, well, it's not like I mean, I did see your Ferrari parked out front, but I mean, like this whole like
foot. Take a look at my shoes. The heel's about to fall off.
But like the notion that you have to defend that, or like people questioning your involvement in the market. It's like there's an ethical way to make a living at this.
I mean, it becomes a kind of tortured position where you have to kind of
self-hating is really
Well, I mean, I'm filled with self-loathing all the time, but it's a way of trying to
That in Sports is brought to you by the American Psychiatric Association.
Yeah, well, we are a business. The artist is like a kind of small business. You control the conditions of your own labor. Ben Davis, this is like the central thesis of his book. That like the artist is essentially trying to be a middle class person, in that I can say, no, Charlie, I don't want to make 50 giant abstract paintings of skulls with rainbows coming out of their ear. Like I know it's sold, but I don't really. Maybe we'll do another one and call it the Deuce, but I can make these sort of choices about what I want to do and how long I want to work. I'm not like a working class guy in that sense that I'm responding to somebody else's directives about what I need to make.
Yeah, you control some of the conditions of your own labor.
That's kind of an illusion. I mean, I spend most of my time, 30 hours a week working as a teacher, under layers and layers of bureaucracy and the kind of nightmarish scenarios that are developing within education, like a 22-item checklist for assessing teachers. It's kind of terrifying.
I'm looking forward to that body of work.
Right, but so I mean, like, as an artist, I kind of aspire to this kind of middle class position and freedom and autonomy, but it's only afforded through selling work, and then, but I'm sort of actually in a working class position, and then we have to deal with the ruling class, banker guy with his Amex Black Card, and maybe no working knowledge of art history, just, some questionable taste and a shit ton of money.
Yeah, but that guy ultimately, I mean, that's the thing. We want to cast, I mean, I think this has been a real education for me in terms of the history of the show with gallerists. Like when I started, I had sort of a notion, I mean, and I had worked for them before, but I think I had a sort of stereotypical notion of what a gallerist was. It did. Yeah. But I think that, I mean, in terms of the more gallerists I've talked to, the more, I mean, in terms of my level of knowledge has developed as a person, like I have a much greater appreciation for the margins and the dedication and the not particularly huge payoff, except for like three people who make all their money on the secondary market anyway.
Right.
So, I mean, I think it's funny, like that guy isn't the bad guy. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that he's not educated. I think it's fortunate that he was kind of rude.
Well, it's just an interesting position to consider.
But at least he's here and interested. Yeah. I think it's a pity that it wasn't a more in-depth interest.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of the struggle is kind of like dealing with that, the kind of simple power that you have when you have a load of money. Yeah. Because it becomes the most important. This kind of capital judgment is more important than any kind of critical judgment. It's just kind of challenging to kind of think about, well, how do we judge what is kind of successful art in this kind of market economy where the obsession is with how much did they pay for it, and just the kind of attention that is paid to like auction returns, and the way that this becomes about this, whether it's an investment vehicle or it's a commodity and this kind of interchangeable part. And so a lot, some of the way that I think about art is also how it sort of relates to like the financial sector and the way that you can take like a mortgage in somebody's home and life and pool it and like just turn it into an abstraction and then sell it for a profit, and that all that kind of thinking starts to like it can get pretty dismal, and so the humor is an attempt at trying to
We should talk. I worked at the Bank of America mortgage bank security lawsuit. One of the more interesting conversations I've had in the history of the show was one with somebody whose work I wasn't particularly fond of, and who in my mind was the poster child of sort of far too famous, far too early, far too much money, and his perspective on it was amazing, which was David Sally, who is a perfectly delightful, charming, extremely intelligent guy. And in talking to him, I kept pushing the question, because he's done 1,000 interviews, he was a little prepared, I don't think he was hiding anything, but he was just he kind of was grinding through his answers. And I finally kind of cornered him with the question about okay, look, you're 30 years old, you've got a retrospective at MoMA, you're making more money than you could possibly know what to do with. What's that like, and what's it like afterwards? And his response was, he's like, I don't really know, because I had to, in order to continue, there are all these people, and I had to do stuff, and he's like, all I did was paint. It was just sort of a blur of painting, and I didn't have to worry about the rent so much. But beyond that, it wasn't really that different than when I wasn't very successful. He's like, it was still, as you mentioned earlier, the sort of middle class. I was still a worker working. So there was just a greater infrastructure surrounding what I was doing that I was largely unaware of.
Money is not inherently evil, No. and within the kind of my
being
major
an asshole
critique.
is.
Well, yeah. Well, in the art world, a lot of even if we don't like an artist's work, we'll still say, well, he's a really nice guy, or she's really awesome, And there's this kind of overlap between the artist's personality and how we view them and then their work, So, it's kind of hard to talk bad about artists, We don't always want to do that.
But this is one of the things I wanted to get to about the politics of your last show and the work that's here, is that one of the things that that has always made you a kind of a Robin Hood style figure amongst our people is that you were talking about the work itself, talked about the direct conditions of what we went through as individual artists, struggling to figure out how, as middle-class kids, we ever thought we could get away with becoming artists when we grew up. The conditions were stacked against us, but somehow
I had no
idea.
Believed it. I don't even know what I thought an artist was. It was some combination of romantic myth and stories, and that I had probably no realistic expectation that I would actually succeed in any meaningful way, and it was kind of going into it blind, and and the more that I learned, the more I was able to kind of put back into the work, because it is being an artist is wonderful, but it's also if anyone in here has never complained about a job, you can leave, it's work, and it's I would disagree with Ben Davis a little bit in his book, and I hope everyone takes the time to read this thing, that, he's sort of the artist controls the conditions of their own labor, but that's only inside the studio. Then you have to come here. You have to
pay the rent.
Not even just you got to work somewhere else, but the job of an artist doesn't kind of start and stop when you go in and put on your painter pants in the studio and switch your shoes and turn on NPR and paint for a while. It's all kinds of social networking, and it's just it has some really gross aspects that make you want to crawl away or stab somebody in the throat.
Because there's a certain reality. Again, with any business, I think the more that you know, the more you understand that there's a depth and a complexity. Mm-hmm. I developed a course that I taught at the University of Wisconsin for a couple of years, Law and Business Skills for Artists. And one of the most sort of sickly entertaining parts of the class was that I broke down the costs and expenses of fabrication, and I'd ask somebody to give me their info or whatever, and of how much it costs to fabricate the work and ship it and do this and that, and the gallery's cut and insurance, and and how much they made at the end of the day, take home. And,
it's pretty dismal.
It's very surprising.
This financial blogger Felix Salmon, we've been discussing trying to get a bunch of artists at different tiers to kind of participate anonymously on a realistic look at their finances.
That'd be fantastic.
Because we never really know. It's so opaque, and half of it's The art world, it's sort of
Did
a
anybody
cash-only
participate?
operation. We haven't gotten people lined up yet. I'm trying to work on a
we
couple
are
of
so
successful
in promoting
people.
this. Let me know, because this sounds like my dream project.
Yeah,
I
and
love it.
really, no, not just what you filed the 1099 for. How much are you
Right.
making? Was there any cash deals?
Right.
Let's see how this really
Stuff out
looks.
the back door.
And defining what and trying to figure out what a successful artistic practice looks like. I mean, my friend Jen Dalton always she says when she does her taxes. During most of the year, she feels like a professional artist. But then when she files her tax returns, she's like, I'm an amateur. I made zero money on this. I may have sold some work, but when I balance it all out, I've made zero. And most of the time it's less than zero.
Yeah, no, the myth. I guess it's good that myths are out there in terms of. Otherwise, no one would go to art school or do it. Because it's very, very tough to obviously to make a living. Although people there's a lot. Look here. There's lots and lots of folks who manage to hobble it together. But I do think that they're more often than not involved in academia or some sideline to pay the bills.
And this is also the tip of the iceberg. In terms of how many artists are out there, I was just kind of thinking about this weird analogy for how my distorted perspective of the art world is this big, ugly tree. There's roots that are spreading out into the earth that nobody can see, tons and tons of artists, and really the money, this kind of little source of light way up in the sky is shining on 2 or 3 really big fat leaves, and then everything else is just kind of wilting underneath it, and it's just getting so sort of weirdly top heavy and just
like the rest of the
strange, that what we see here, it looks like a lot of art, but it is really, nothing of how much is out there.
This is not even the tip of the iceberg.
Well, but also we're talking about is a rarefied part of a rarefied market already, because we're talking about the contemporary art trajectory, right?
Yeah.
You're not talking about the people who do the Burgee clay prints that they sell at the souvenir
or
shop.
Etsy land, or
right.
there's so many.
Whatever. I don't begrudge those people making a living either. But
this kind of income inequality stuff is manifesting in the art world too. There are some studies out there that measure that kind of middle class galleries or middle tier galleries are starting to shrink year over year, whereas more plutocratic galleries are growing, and this is exactly what we hear over and over again.
But there'll never be a
death rate of galleries in
shortage. There'll never
Chicago
be a
is
shortage of
incredible.
gallery. In New York, it's just there. What there'll be a shortage of is a stable kind of platform where a gallery can develop a program for 15 or 20 years and see some artists through.
Yeah.
There'll always be this kind of we've got the new ones, and then basically the big blue chip galleries will be okay, we thank you for developing that one. We'll take them now and put them on our roster.
Although this is a weird time in terms of that business, particularly because of disposable income for people who tend to be collecting, the sort of middle classy collectors, or artists buying other artists' work, or people who are interested, hobbyists, who aren't serious collectors with tons of resources. I think a lot of that has gotten stopped out of the market, and I think that is the bread and butter for a lot of the emerging artist sort of gallery.
Yeah, what was Josh Baer saying yesterday? It sounded like he was talking a little bit about Amazon or trying to use eBay. eBay selling art, and that if you had
details,
3
though, 'cause I'm curious
million
as to
artists,
the 3 million artist figure. I want to know where that comes from.
Well,
because it's that's a nice round number. I wonder what study.
To put art into context of how it relates to broader society. I was doing a drawing for Art Papers. They're doing an issue on art magazines, right? So the magazine with the highest paid circulation is Art News, which is kind of little
the USA
trade.
Today.
It's the USA Today of art. And I love Robin Semblist, who edits that, but relative to other magazines, there's a third, fourth rate golf magazine called Golf Fancier that has a paid subscription of 350,000. So we're talking the worst golf magazine out there. Has several times more readership than the art magazine. This MFA, sphere of visual art is so small that all these startups who are we're gonna redefine distribution and production of art and sell it. We're gonna be the avant-garde. It's like crickets out there. Cat print. Maybe a really nice watercolor of a cat meowing. There's a market for that.
Hang in there.
Right. Yeah. Hang in there, kitty. But I'm waiting.
I have that tattooed on my back.
I'm waiting for artsy. I want to see a receipt of them selling something over $10,000 to somebody. what we hear about is, we get some vague numbers, but
that probably exists now on eBay. I mean, there are art sales and art object sales. I mean, you're kind of taking your chances with anything you buy there, but in terms of its legitimacy.
There's just so much sort of this idea that you could get the art market to grow if we could just tap into this huge, pool of Americans, if we get them to turn off the TV or something, go buy some art online. I just don't know that this particular kind of art that we're all involved in has much appeal, to a culture that's so much, it's oriented around entertainment to such a large degree.
But it's like death metal, right? Yeah. Like death metal has a cultivated audience of people who are aficionados who appreciate it. It has a market. It has people who are willing to pour money into it. It's a tiny group of people. They're interested. People outside of that market, it's hard to get them introduced to it because either they're interested or they're not. If you're not listening to, whatever, I don't know any death metal bands offhand, but so this notion that if perhaps contemporary art was more accessible or if people were more educated, then suddenly they would flock here. Yeah. It's just not.
Well, it's kind of condescending too, though, a little bit to be like, well, if you just understood what this thing is that we've been working on for hundreds of years, you would really grow to appreciate it and love it.
That's like the institutional position.
Yeah. In so many ways. I know. I mean, there's two things you can't criticize art education. If you take art, put some kids in it, you're gold. We'll fund that. But that's really about it for public funding for arts. I
wonder why that is. Why does it all fall off after eighth grade? You should got to stop caring after. If you're older than 12, fuck you. We don't care.
Well, we have a hard time kind of unifying on the left in this country, and I feel like the art world is a very progressive sphere. It's open and tolerant, but that's a bubble, within a larger culture that just doesn't, I kind of like how Art Expo is in the Navy Pier. It's there's this just people enjoying themselves, going on speedboat rides, and we're in here, with this weird stuff. I feel like an alien to
these
a
weird
degree.
Subversive conversations.
Oh, yeah. We're going to go out and change things at Art Expo.
I'm gonna dial this back and get back to your show a little bit because I want to talk about the politics of being an artist parodying other artists, right? So doing a kind of art critic's job while you parody us as artists and makers and the reason that those people are cranky is because you hit it so close to the bone, right? That you really do identify the modalities.
Yeah, some people I think can take it very personally if they kind of project and see themselves within one of the kind of tropes. But I'm working within tropes. We're all working within the context of Western art history. I think the kind of sad realization is when you see how much of it is not really about originality or being new. It's just about kind of fitting into a recognizable tradition. And, we can appreciate that work. But, as I posted the image of the piece, or Hyperallergic ran it, and it got out on Twitter, and an artist friend of mine was like, I love this and I hate this. Because we recognize that we're doing a lot of the same stuff over and over again. History doesn't move in a neat arrow towards some, predetermined point where we're going to find perfection or something. It's obviously a wheel, and it's a mess, and we got to keep doing things over and over again. But I just think it's a little it's exacerbated within the market. Well, how do I get to that, Oscar Murillo money? How do I do that? So I see the shiny things are selling. I'm gonna do this. I think a lot of artists can handle a little criticism. If you guys went through an MFA program or you've sat in on an MFA crit, they're fucking brutal. You're there to tear apart your enemies and support your allies, even if they have horrible work, and it's this constant kind of internal criticism. And to think that the market, you can't criticize stuff. We had a nice little chat with Tony who runs this, and it was yes, we are here to respect the work and grow this thing, and it's fantastic. Yes, and it's, a lot of glad handling. But, the process of being an artist is brutal. We constantly kind of battle about what is valid, what is useful, what is interesting. And, we do all of that, and critics talk about it. But then really the most important judgment right now out there is what people pick to buy. you know, and then that carries a kind of, I feel like, an undue amount of importance, you know, just because you can afford to buy it, you know, therefore you must be the smartest person in the room.
Well, and whoever sold that work, that changes the material conditions of their life and allows them a kind of access or a kind of princessy position that is not afforded to the rest of their peers.
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly, and we could have a long conversation about privilege, but if there was an actual activist here, you know, somebody who could speak to this stuff,
this is an art fair, right?
Yeah, you know, and they're not going to be here. I mean, usually they should be picketing outside, you know, like Occupy museums with like a trade situation, you know, but I don't know. It's just depressing on some level. Sorry.
And it is and it isn't. Because it's part of the conditions in which we live, right? And we make a living. And one of the things that I've always admired about your work is that you're willing to kind of deal with those conditions and not kind of hide them or not talk about these things. Because, I mean, it is a depressing conversation, and it's a bummer, and we're all kind of really subject to it in different ways. But it's worse when no one talks about it.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I mean, there's a certain sense that it would just be easier for me if I just shut up and like make some pretty paintings or something. I don't know what I would do, but it would be a lot easier. There'd be less criticism and like, you're a hypocrite, you son of a bitch, shut up, you know, stop ruining the party, you know. But it's...
What specifically?
Somebody's got to do it.
What specifically is depressing? I mean, we've complained at length for the last 9 years, and I feel like in some ways complaining about the art market or lack of access or the classism of certain aspects of it or whatever, sort of like being pissed off at the tide.
Well,
so
yeah, but I mean, it is. It's there's the frustration is a kind of, and what's depressing is the lack of agency. Like for me, you know, there's sort of like awareness of how value creation works, you know, like painting these pyramids of like selectivity and really kind of like having this aha moment that it's mostly like magic. Like there's nothing, objectively true about any of this. It's like, this is now worth $1 million, you know?
Right.
And if we say it's art and somebody else believes it, Shazam, it works. And you get to a point where you realize this and then you're like, well, I can show this to people, we can talk about it, and it just doesn't matter. Because we're not in control of that situation, you know? It's the sort of top tier, you know, whether it's plutocrats or oligarchs making the decisions about what is going to be worth that much money, and sort of creating it, not even just making a decision like, oh, somebody priced this and now I'm going to, you know, confirm it. That kind of like looping up process. I mean, your last guest was sort of like, well, I just hope I don't have to, you know, change my principles as a curator when I start having to deal with like very rich people who are like, hey, I just bought an artist and you might want to take a look at their work and potentially give them a show and I'll cut you a check, you know. And we know it's kind of how it works a little bit.
To your question, Richard, like, I think if you abstract all the some of these points that have been made in a recent conversation here, is that there's a decoupling. There seems to be a decoupling from kind of critical discourse and critical feedback and value. You know, and where patronage in the art world, there's always been this kind of awkward dance between wealth, and it's gone on from time immemorial. It's not a new thing. But it appears that there is, at least, maybe it was an illusion, right, that it was Harold Rosenberg or Clement Greenberg, they kind of set the table and allowed for an understanding and a respect for abstract expressionism, and curators like Henry Geldzahler and other people helped to, really give almost academic and, just critical buttressing to the value of art. And it was not ludicrous, right? It was legit. Whereas now there appears to be like really the context in which an artwork is seen, and to William's point, the value or the price that is assigned and the price that a piece sold really does kind of tell a lot of the story, right? I mean, it didn't matter to the Dan Cohen show, which sold out, that William talked about a long time ago, that it was universally pilloried as not only stupid and derivative, but insensitive, right? Because it came out in a particularly grim time of like post-collapse. And it just didn't matter. It didn't matter at all. And when I hear William, when I listen to William, and I do it a lot, that's what I sense a rage that maybe it was always illusory that critical feedback and academic judgment and careful consideration conferred value on art objects. But I would say that if it ever was, it certainly is not now, because it does not matter what happens.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious what's going to happen with the Matthew Day Jackson show. It got like one of the worst art reviews I've ever read in my life in New York, in the New Yorker, and I mean it's amazing. And I just wonder, will that have any influence whatsoever on how much those like vitrines with skulls sell for? I doubt it.
And this behavior of the market conferring value on art, which ostensibly is this kind of it's this utterance that comes from the essence of William, the essence of you guys as artists. You know what I mean? It's your magic discourse that you make is what you choose to make. But this is also
we're fucking wizards, man.
Yeah, you are wizards.
It's there's a lot of when we talk about the smoke and mirrors in the art world and the hocus pocus, and just like how weird it must be for somebody who's kind of like if you're not really in the art world, I feel like you're a civilian, and I start just calling people civilians, like, oh, you're a civilian. You walk through and you kind of like see the gallerinas, and there's this kind of like fourth wall, like the performance is happening. You're like, they're unassailable people, look at them, but really when you go to the other side of it and you're like looking out from the booth, it's like, oh, look at these fucking strollers and these people, go away, you smell, I don't want to talk to you. I mean, it's just this weird relationship, and so much of it is like just perception. Like that Zwerner booth in the middle of this fair is like a castle, a fortress of like power. It crackles, I mean, I get scared. I don't even want to go in there. But what my favorite piece in the show is in one of those booths. It's like these little Robert Gobers, and I'm like, thank God for Robert Gober. Like, you just saved my fair-going experience. But I think the last kind of point that I want to make is that, modernism itself was an ideological program that was kind of buffering art from capitalism and just like the market as it was kind of growing. And we don't have that anymore. We don't have, postmodernism is a kind of mishmash of crazy shit and kind of ironic distancing from the horror truth, of like, is it really, but the market is just like the thing now, I'm not sure art has much other purpose.
Is it about scale, though? I mean, you talk about Clement Greenberg and you talk about that era of art, which I do think is probably highly romanticized at this point. I think art, even if we're being clear-headed about it and lumps and all, like, is still a very, history is written by the victors. Like, I mean, it's stylized, but that was a lot tinier world on a number of levels.
Well, but I mean, it wasn't just
number
art.
Of people.
I mean, think about like there's a great documentary on the Eames, Charles and Ray Eames, and they were like modernist cold warriors. That was like when I think of modernism, I think of them more than like Greenberg. I don't think of like Pollock, really changing the world, but I think of that Eames chair, in this program that like we're going to beat the Russians and look at how great modernism is going to be. Your whole life is going to look like this, and that's gone. I mean, it's in IKEA, but it's
affordable to all of us,
right? Right. What is it? The best for the most for the least.
There it is.
Yeah. So I don't. I'm just. The market is the kind of like thing that we're dealing with.
Well, to end on because we do have to wrap it up, to end on a sort of rah-rah note. I mean, like, I think that, kudos to you for doing the good work and having perspective and keeping a sense of humor about it, but also doing that analysis. I mean, in some ways, I think artists, particularly like yourself, who are maintaining perspective and looking at the greater universe and their place in it, have taken the place of some of that critical analysis that critics used to do.
Well, they're arguing about their criticism right now. Like the Brooklyn Rail is this paper in Brooklyn that's got, 3 successive issues like responding to this idea of crisis and criticism. Or you've got like Triple Canopy publishing International Art English, pissing off Eflux, who then, got these like internal battles that no civilian who doesn't, understand what the term "the other" means, is really going to care about, And it's like, let's get some writing done, or figure it out, like, let's just kind of move past that, like, just constant internal battle, I guess. I don't know if that's possible, but it'd be nice, if we could get some critical discourse.
I think the most political thing that you could do as an artist is to just be a decent human being and be thoughtful. But as a dealer, too.
Yeah. What else can you do?
And there it is. We are done. There is no time for our questions. If you as an audience member have a question, I say corner Charlie or William in the booth, and either would be happy to talk to you. Thank you guys so much.
And there's a merch table in the back. William will be handing out pitchforks and torches if anyone wants to march.
Thanks.